Welcome everyone to the Mirowitz Center program, part 4 of Women in Art with Dale Sharon. This is such a wonderful program. And if you have any friends that want to join us, that would be great. It doesn't matter whether you've missed 1 and 2 or 3. Each program is just wonderful, and you can always catch up on the recording. So Dale, thank you so much for being with us today, and welcome everyone to the Mirowitz program. And I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thanks for having me. And I mean, Judy, you are always so timely. I mean, look, it's 10 o'clock. It's amazing. At any rate, I want to just say welcome back to everyone and wish you all a happy new year and a healthy one, which we need to do at this time. I mean, it's, I hope you're all staying safe and your family is healthy during this kind of crazy time. But that being said, let's begin. I mean, last month, we looked at women artists from the Middle Ages through the end of World War I. And I have to say they were an impressive group of artists. But the artists we're going to see today are just as impressive. And as we saw last month, women have been creating art forever. Yet they've been overlooked and undervalued compared to their male counterparts. Only a few of them ever became respected artists in their own right, and even less were celebrated and well known. Now, this whole concept changes dramatically in the 20th century, when many female artists made a name for themselves in all types of art. And we've heard their names, the famous female artists that influenced generations that followed. Artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, Louise Bourgeois, Helen Frankenthaler. And chances are you are all at least somewhat familiar with their work and their artistic vision. They reinvented American art forever. Now, in truth, we would need several lifetimes to properly pay homage to all of the influential women artists who left their mark on art history. From painters and printmakers to sculptors and photographers, their artistry changed, inspired, and influenced the art world. So let's take a look at this cartoon. The subtitle down here says, it's called Souvenir Tea Towels on a Washing Line. And it's a comment on the way that men get to create the memorable art while women get saddled with the housework. I think the attitude in this cartoon changed rapidly in the 20th century. Women now had the courage to speak for themselves. They were not, as my husband would say, hanging around for the men in their lives to rescue them. These famous female artists have more in common than their gender and their career path. They are all trailblazers in their own right, with many breaking barriers in their personal and public life. So let's look at a few. By the Depression, many artists began to focus on the poverty and suffering in the United States. These next artists are examples of the focus on the economic crisis of the 30s. They began to see the potential in art to act as a powerful instigation of social and political change. So let's begin with an icon of the Great Depression. This photograph on the left was taken in 1936 in the Central Valley of California and became a symbol of the plight of the migrant farm workers during America's Great Depression. In early March of 1936, Dorothea Lange, the photographer, drove past a sign reading Pea Pickers Camp in Nepoma, California. At the time, she was working as a photographer for the Resettlement Association, the RA, another one with a lot of labels. At any rate, it was a Depression-era government agency that was formed to raise public awareness of and provide aid to struggling farmers. At the camp, she encountered a mother and her children. She said, "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet." She later recalled, she said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding field and birds that the children had killed. Lang took 7 exposures of the woman, 32-year-old Florence Owens Thompson, with various combinations of her 7 children. One of these exposures, with its tight focus on Thompson's face, transformed her into a Madonna-like figure and became the icon of the Great Depression and one of the most famous photographs in history. This photograph, Migrant Mother, is easily the most influential photograph of Lang's career. The mother looks worried for the future, but knows she has to be strong for her children who depend on her. She supports the pyramidal composition, and you can see that here, this pyramidal composition. And it kind of is a symbol of how she supports her family. The image taps into both the anguish and perseverance of a mother trying to care for her children in a time of economic, social, and ecological crisis. The photograph that became known as Migrant Mother was published in the paper the following day on March 11th, accompanying the editorial, "What does the New Deal mean to this mother and her children?" The same day, the Los Angeles Times reported that the State Relief Administration would deliver food rations to 2,000 itinerant fruit pickers in Nepoma the next day. So navigating between the artistic and the journalistic, Dorothea Lange excelled in distilling individuals into power and empathetic Black and white images with the hopes of motivating social and economic reform. Lange ran a successful portrait studio in San Francisco beginning in 1919, but with the onset of the Depression, she was moved to photograph people that she saw standing in bread lines, tenant farmers, such as the man on the right, and those most affected by the Depression. Lange's commitment to social justice and her faith in the power of photography to confront the urgent circumstances around her remained constant throughout her life. Ellis Neil was also one of those artists. Her early paintings revealed the blend of bohemianism, sexual freedom, and radical politics that shaped her vision in the 1930s. Adversity was Neil's middle name. Her free-spirited nature was quick to collide headlong with domestic disasters at every turn. If her 2-year-old stint in Cuba and an early marriage to a well-to-do Cuban was fraught with troubles, the death of a first infant daughter to diphtheria almost broke her spirit. When her husband fled back to Cuba, he took her second daughter, Isabella, with him. In New York, she fell in with a sort of questionable crowd of artists, writers and ne'er-do-wells, who frequently found their way into her paintings. She also became politically active, marching on picket lines and joining the Communist Party. Neil's Communist Party career was really brief. She later confessed that her hatred of bureaucracy made her a really bad communist. Her painting, You Need a Biscuit Strike, is a darkly dynamic street scene with demonstrators falling under a regiment of mounted police while sidewalk witnesses stand wrapped in attention. In the 1930s, when the National Biscuit Company, producer of Unita Biscuits, does anybody remember Unita Biscuits? I don't remember them, but anyway, they sharply cut wages for workers in order to sustain dividend payments for shareholders. And these moves sparked outrage and labor strikes at plants in New York, Philadelphia, and Atlanta. The particular painted scene, most likely on the streets of New York, show a worker with a sign reading, "Lockout, Unita workers." The toll of economic desperation haunts many of her paintings. Neil sought to depict the rage for social justice the Depression spurred among union members, reformers, and communist sympathizers. She was obsessed with capturing the turmoil of her times. Every class, every race, every gender came under Neil's razor-sharp gaze, and no human comes away unscathed. And you can see that in the portraits on the right that are really that aren't in Slamp's collection. She was convinced that people's images reflect the era in a way that nothing else could. What becomes evident in confronting Neil's subjects is her singularly uncompromising style. One of the foremost women artists of the 20th century, Isabelle Bishop, is probably best known for her paintings and drawings of shop girls, secretaries, and down and out men around Union Station in New York City. At the time, Union Square, I said Union Station, I meant Union Square. At the time, Union Square area was one of the busiest commercial and entertainment districts of the city, although much faded from its fashionable days in the late 19th century. 3 major department stores were nearby, as well as many individual lofts and small businesses that employed thousands of people. Numerous vaudeville and burlesque theaters, movie houses, billiard parlors, and amusement game halls were also in the vicinity. The sea of humanity that loitered in the park or passed through the neighborhood on a daily basis provided Isabelle Bishop with a wealth of subject for decades and decades. Bishop was a perceptive observer of everyday activities of young women who frequented offices and stores in her neighborhood. Her paintings introduced working women as a vibrant subject for American art scene, which focused on the daily lives of the urban population. According to Bishop's recollection, a young unemployed clerical worker offered to pose for the artist. Encounter depicts this woman and her boyfriend, with whom she had a rather stormy romance. It's rendered in soft amber tones and has a quality of kind of having been erased or washed away, even as it gives us a detailed look into their encounter. There's an obvious exchange occurring between the 2 figures in the painting, though its exact nature remains kind of unclear. With a keen sense of observation and great technical skill, she portrayed ordinary people sitting on park benches or soda fountain stools, riding the subway or strolling the neighborhood during lunch hour. She depicted her subjects with an uncritical eye, presented in a sympathetic manner that imbued them with innate humanity. Maria Martinez grew up on a pueblo called San Ildefonso, near Santa Fe, New Mexico. The craft of making pottery was handed down from generation to generation, where she learned to make pottery from her aunt and trained 3 younger generations of her family. She and her husband began making the famous black on black pottery in 1918. The couple gained an international reputation for their work, with matte black decorations on polished black surfaces. The areas that appear blacker and shinier are burnished or polished, and the feathers are the unpolished clay. These pieces are based on shards or ancient pottery dug up around their pueblo. The designs are symbols containing messages regarding rituals, hunts, and pueblo activities. The work was a communal activity. In the pueblo, artistic creation was a form of prayer. The feather design is an abstraction based on natural form. Martinez introduced a new style of pottery to the Southwest that expanded ancient blackware traditions. And starting around 1920, these non-traditional pots became wildly popular with collectors. I wish I had bought some a long time ago. They are really expensive today. She showed works and demonstrated pottery making at the World's Fair until World War II, helping to bring Martinez international fame and elevate the popularity of Pueblo pottery in general. Martinez and her husband have been credited with the revitalizing of the traditions of pottery making. In part, the national popularity of their pottery can be attributed to the fact that, as Maria simply stated, black goes with anything. The granddaughter of former slaves, Elizabeth Cantlett was raised in Washington, D.C. Her father died before she was born, and her mother held several jobs to raise her 3 children. Refused admission to Carnegie Institute of Technology because of her race, Cantlett enrolled in Howard University, where she graduated with honors in 1935 and went on to earn the first MFA in sculpture at the University of Iowa 5 years later. She drew subjects from African American and later Mexican life. Her subjects ranged from tender maternal images to confrontational symbols of the Black Power movement. Sharecropper reveals Elizabeth Cantlett's lifelong concern for the marginalized and the dignity of women. I absolutely love this print. Vivid markings create this anonymous woman's weathered skin, textured white hair, and broad-brimmed straw hat. Fatigue is evident in her eyes, and a makeshift safety pin holds her lightweight jacket closed. She represents the many sharecroppers who rented land in an agricultural system that Cantlett felt kept thousands of African Americans in a cycle of poverty. By focusing on the enduring strength of poor laborers, Cantlett hoped to find a voice to speak for people who do not have one. In 1946, Cantlett moved to Mexico City. There she worked with a printmaking collective dedicated to using art to promote social change. Like her own grandparents, these African American sharecroppers were former enslaved people, or else their descendants were. And under the rural South's racist farming system, they continued to be exploited long after slavery's end. But sharecropper is hardly intended to arouse pity or rage. Its composition and cropping make the viewer look up to this figure as someone to be respected and even venerated. The safety pin that holds her jacket closed is a succinct sign of poverty, while her broad-brimmed straw hat would have sheltered her from the sun when working in the fields. The economy of the print's narrative is countered by the variety of patterns and marks in its dramatic lighting. These, along with the simplified planes of the figure's body, face, and hat, demonstrate Cantlett's modernity. A lustrous finish emphasizes the mahogany wood grain that artist Elizabeth Cantlett beautifully incorporated into seated woman. The figure's rounded body and firmly placed legs convince a kind of a confidence and strength and stability. A sense of naturalism merges perfectly with this simplified abstracted form reminiscent of African and Mexican sculpture. Cantlett felt affirmative representations such as seated woman could support social change because they allow women who were underrepresented to see themselves depicted in art. Female subjects are predominant throughout her work. She was moved by Black beauty, not the female nudes of European artists, but the women of African wood carvers and pre-Hispanic stone carvers. After the Second World War, the art world was characterized by a feeling of having won, not just a military war, but a cultural war as well. The French and their school at Paris had been routed. Also defeated was the American Depression painting, as well as landscape illustrations of a naive America and manifest destiny. Now, the triumphant society would be represented by works of art that expressed America metaphorically through sheer size or through potent symbols. American art, like American culture, was a global phenomenon, and New York was at its core. This was a site of many movements, from abstract expressionism to pop art to minimalism and so on. Sculpture and deck arts and photography and printmaking blossomed and matured, and women artists were a part of it all, blazing a new trail for generations of women to follow. So let's first look at women painters. Their only rule was that there were no rules. Anything was possible for these next artists. Helen Frankenthaler's constant high artistic achievement ranks her as one of the most important contributors to the history of post-war American painting, male or female. Growing up on Manhattan's Upper East Side, Frankenthaler absorbed the privileged Black background of a cultured and progressive Jewish intellectual family. Her father was Alfred Frankenthaler, a respected New York State Supreme Court judge. On her 21st birthday, she received an inheritance from her father that enabled her to secure her own New York apartment while also maintaining a separate studio. She and Clement Greenberg, one of the foremost art critics of the day, and a recognized spokesman for the then emerging abstract expressionist New York school, began a close relationship that continued till 1955. Through him, she met painter Robert Motherwell, whom she married in 1958. Inspired by American artist Jackson Pollock's technique of working directly on the floor, Frankenthaler poured washes of thin paint directly onto raw, unstretched canvas in watery washes, kind of like a stain painting. This style is known as color field, with blurry shapes, elegant swatches of soft color. First and foremost a colorist, Frankenthaler poured cans of paint onto raw canvas, allowing the material to form kind of amorphous shapes, which you can see in both of these paintings. The result of this soak stain method was an almost water-like appearance with the color. She often made watercolors in reaction to places she visited on her travels. While her canvases are abstractions, they often evoke elements of landscapes or figural forms. According to Frankenthaler, my pictures are full of climates, abstract climates. They're not nature per se, but a feeling. Bermuda High illustrates that feeling. As a woman of abstract expressionism, Frankenthaler broke through the masculine-dominated movement and let her own unique artistic voice be heard. Compared to the women artists around her, she was enormously successful, an exception to the rule that only men could occupy center stage in the New York art world. Grace Hartigan was also a leading abstract expressionist painter, known for combining gestural abstraction with imagery derived from art history and popular culture. Hartigan began inserting recognizable imagery into her abstractions, which often consisted of kind of dense networks of expressionistic shapes and splotches of color. In our painting, bold brushstrokes enliven the surface of Stone and Star. Hartigan cited poetry as a major source of inspiration and sometimes included alphabetical forms in her work. Here, the artist suggests the letters A, S, and O. You can see some of those here. She was the only female artist included in the New York The New York Painting, an exhibition organized by the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1958. Kay Sage was one of the most prominent women associated with surrealism in the United States. Surrealism sought to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind, for example, by the irrational juxtaposition of images. Like many surrealists, they utilize landscaped imagery as a metaphor for the psychological states of being. Art painting is an ambiguous, angular form set against an expansive gray background. Now, this painting's muted palette and sense of mystery are really hallmarks of Kay Sage. It represents a typically cold and impenetrable view of the world, a threatening and uninhabitable terrain. But it's really confusing. I think most surrealist paintings are confusing. Its shape can be read as a mountaintop, as seen from a distance, which it definitely looks like. But it also can be seen as a gathering of fabric viewed at close range. And if you look closely, it'll kind of look like fabric gathered together. I think that's kind of neat. After a privileged childhood, Sage moved to Paris, where she met fellow painter Yves Tanguay, became involved with the Surrealist group, and started what she would later call her real life. Her landscapes turned from natural vistas into barren psychological spaces. Constructed in her mind, Sage built stage sets on canvas. She had complex and destructive personal and working relationship with Tanguay. Although it seemed that Sage could not live without her partner, friends recalled that they did not live together harmoniously either. Following the unexpected death of Tanguay, she suffered greatly at the end of her life. As a concluding tragedy, Sage became partly blind and took her own life. She tragically stated, "I have said all that I have to say. There is nothing left for me to do but scream." Audrey Flagg was one of the pioneers of photorealism when it emerged in the 1960s. The daughter of Polish Jewish immigrants, Flagg grew up in Washington Heights, New York, among Holocaust refugees and survivors. No one characteristic defines Flagg's work. "I have never considered myself a Jewish artist," she said, "or a woman artist. To me, an artist is an artist, and great art can cut across all boundaries." Flagg herself is a boundary crosser. In the 50s, her vivid photorealist paintings launched her into the forefront of a major art movement. Lauded as a pioneer of this style, Flagg was the first photorealist painter whose work was purchased by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Flagg achieved the photoreal effect by projecting, tracing, and recoloring photographs onto oversized canvases. She produced vanitas works. Vanitas are traditionally still life paintings that deal with or symbolize kind of the transience of life to remind us of our mortality. In our painting, we have East versus West, Christianity versus Buddhism, metal and glass and porcelain and jewels, all objects from her cluttered apartment, all highlighted by distinct color, lending her a dramatic, hyper-realistic quality. A large painting like this, she said, usually took her 3 or 4 months. Born in Buffalo, Susan Rothenberg was active in New York's vital downtown art scene in the 70s. Her painter mother and ceramicist aunt encouraged her to pursue her artistic talent at a young age. She also developed a love of animals, encouraged by her uncle, who was a veterinarian. Her breakout paintings of silhouetted horses resounded at a time when many thought that painting was not abstract, and the painting that was not abstract had lost its relevance. Her painting is then centered on life-size images of horses, glyph-like and iconic, and these mysterious images carried a strong emotional charge. Rothenberg married the artist Bruce Nauman in 1989, and in the following year, they moved from the city to a ranch in New Mexico, where they've remained ever since. Rothenberg's painting reflects scenes excerpted from daily life and come to life through Rothenberg's thickly layered and nervous brushstroke and texture. Her backgrounds are filled with action, as you see in Mondrian Dancing. The figures seem to multiply. I think that motion itself is kind of the subject of this painting. Abstract expressionist Joan Mitchell was complicated, driven, and a genius. Mitchell's composition may have been agreeable, but that didn't readily translate into her own life. Known for her aggressive personality, only made worse by a drinking problem, Mitchell's toughness also helped her thrive in a male-dominated milieu. She was brutal to some people. She would reduce people to tears at dinner parties. Her orneriness was the palace guard of her character, they said. She is known for her compositional rhythms, bold coloration, and sweeping gestural brushstrokes of her large and often multi-paneled paintings, like this one. Mitchell's early success in the 1950s was striking at a time when few women artists were recognized. She referred to herself as the last abstract expressionist, and she continued to create abstract paintings until her death in 1992. The broad strokes and drips are arranged in an abstract landscape that Joan Mitchell titled Ici, French for here. Although Mitchell painted Ici in France shortly before her death, the very location of this abstracted landscape is left open for interpretation. since here could be anywhere. Julie Meritu was born in Ethiopia and today lives and works in New York City. Meritu's points of departure are architecture in the city, particularly the densely populated urban environments of the 21st century. Her canvases overlay different architectural features such as columns, facades, and porticos, with graphical chart building plans, city maps, and architectural renderings seen from different perspectives. Her paintings present a sort of tornado of color that look like layers of graffiti or kind of like a bomb just went off. Meritu has described her rich canvases as story maps of no location, seeing them as pictures into an imagined rather than actual reality. She makes large-scale gestural paintings that are built up through layers of acrylic paint on canvas, overlaid with mark making. She uses pencil and pen and ink and streams of paint, such as in gray space. The result is a combination of detailed drawing with bold color, offering the spectator distinct modes of viewing, from looking up close and looking at it from a distance. Sculpture was once considered the domain of ambitious male artists, a medium as challenging in its physicality as it was limitless in scope. But for several decades, artists from Eva Hess to Nancy Graves to Louise Bourgeois and Kiki Smith have carved a place for women working in contemporary sculpture. These female artists have created some of the most interesting, challenging, and ambitious sculptures and have pushed the medium to new and at times unexpected limits. Born in Russia, Louise Nevelson's big break came at age 60. Can you imagine? When her monochrome found wood constructions were included in a show in the Museum of Modern Art in 1959. That show was also the launching pad for Jasper Johns, Ellsworth Kelly, Robert Rauschenberg, and Frank Stella, and all of them were younger than Nevelson's son. By the time she died in 1988, at 88 years old, she was a bona fide cultural legend. In her flamboyant heyday, Nevelson's thick eyelashes, which kind of look like, I think, tiny mink stoles on her eyes, and dramatic way with a headscarf were as emblematic of the New York art scene as Warhol's white wig. In 1985, she appeared at the White House to receive a National Medal of Arts from President Reagan. She was photographed for the cover of Life magazine, and she was the subject of a set of Louise Nevelson's commemorative stamps issued in 2000 by the US Postal Service. She lived what one might call a bohemian existence in New York, having many affairs with famous men. She was a classic example of celebrity. Louise Nevelson's father, who owned a thriving lumber business, brought the family to Rockport, Maine after fleeing the abuse aimed at Jewish communities in Russia in 1905 and successfully established the same business. In 1920, Louise accepted a proposal of marriage to a wealthy businessman and lived on Central Park West. 2 years later, Louise gave birth to a son, Myron. Nevelson never adapted to life as a housewife. She realized that to become a serious artist, she had to abdicate her roles as wife and mother. So in 1931, she left her husband, placed her son in her parents' care, and headed for Munich, Germany to study painting. Upon her return to the States, Nevelson settled in New York City, established a studio, and began her routine of foraging for wooden remnants, boards of all proportions and qualities, turned wood that had served as legs of tables, desks, and beds, carved pieces, curved arms of chairs, scraps. She would then build a series of shallow boxes the same size. In each box, she would arrange and rearrange a group of remnants until she was satisfied with the composition. When all the boxes in the sculpture were completed, Nevelson painted them all black, white, or gold. And because the separate elements have been unified with a single paint color, New Continent reads simultaneously as many small works and one monumental sculpture. She called these works sculptured walls. Nevelson lived near poverty until her middle years, yet she left an estate of $100 million on her death, with many of her works in the world's major museums. She was highly publicized as an eccentric, flamboyant, and sexually liberated woman who became an inspiring force in the feminist movement. Yet she described herself as not a feminist. She said, "I am an artist who happens to be a woman." Anne Truitt was one of the leading figures associated with minimalism, the sculptural tendency that emerged in the 1960s, featuring pared down geometric shapes. Truitt grew up on Maryland's Eastern Shore, and she settled in Washington, D.C. in 1960, maintaining a succession of studios during a period when you could afford to buy something in Washington, D.C. Anne Truitt painted horizontal bands of orange, fuchsia, blue, and lime green onto a rectangular column made of sanded plywood. Through her characteristic vertical forms, Truitt investigated the boundary between painting and sculpture. She described her freestanding painted objects as color, set free in 3 dimensions. Inspired by simple geometry, Truitt applied elements of painting, such as composition and color, to her sculptural works. Truitt's art is unique within the field of minimalism. She alone remained a traditional studio artist, whereas artists such as Donald Judd abandoned the studio and enlisted industrial fabrication and materials. Truitt painted and sanded her wood sculptures by hand in multiple layers. And while many minimalists favored neutral tones, Truitt developed a daring palette that ranged from deep reds and blacks to pale yellows and lavenders. Eva Hess was born into a family of observant Jews in Hamburg, Germany in 1936. When Hess was 2 years old, her parents sent her and her older sister to the Netherlands to escape Nazi Germany. In 1938, the family fled and settled in New York City. Eva Hess is known for her organic shaped sculpture. In our mixed media drawing, she constructs a slightly off-kilter grid of small hand-drawn circles. She creates texture with dense graphite marks and opaque white gouache, a water-based paint, which she scrapes into the handle of a wooden paintbrush. Hess went on to create works of art with such materials as latex, fiberglass, polyethylene, wire, and plaster. And on the right are some examples of her sculptures from other museums. She used repetition of forms, whether circles or squares, with hanging wires and tubes. And like many other sculptors, she needed to employ fabricators to deal with these materials and transform her drawings into sculptures. It's interesting that the workshop that Hess used was staffed by men who were all Holocaust survivors. When looking at a photograph of Eva Hess, one is struck by her eternal youth, as if she were caught in a time warp. There are no photos of her aging because she died of cancer at age 34. Although her art career was brief and her life tragic, her work is memorable and continues to influence the work of contemporary artists today. Rebecca Horn's works are abstract, unpredictable, machine-based, and often weird. Her work was initially shaped by illness. As a young art and philosophy student, she began building polyester and fiberglass sculptures without realizing the toxicity of her materials, and she suffered serious lung poisoning. She spent lonely months in a sanatorium, emerging with a determination to blend fantasy and reality, body and machine, human and animal. Birds and beasts and insects fascinate her. Rebecca Horn works in a symbolic language. She claims her works are about transformation, the personal transformation of the individual. This work is attached to the wall and is propelled by a mechanical motor. Feathers fan out in a circle, fall, and begin their slow rotation again. Rebecca Horn's kinetic sculptures of moving feathers and wings suggest the way that animals and plants have been replaced by machines as objects of primary importance in modern culture. Horn's work also evokes the cyclical rhythms of nature and life, for example, the seasonal shedding of feathers and so on. These works function by themselves due to incorporated mechanisms in them. In this sense, technology influences the human life in every aspect. Over her 4-decade-long career, Kiki Smith was known as a leader of the downtown art scene that emerged in Manhattan, and many of her pieces have a kind of dark fairy tale quality, as if they could illustrate pages from the Brothers Grimm. Since the early 1980s, Kiki Smith has been making works of art that have an uncommon power in a wide array of media that includes sculpture, printmaking, drawing, photography, video, and installation. Her themes include mortality, the human body, and the lives of women. She renders the figure in frank terms, expressing its both vulnerability and its strength. She said, "I always think the whole history of the world is in your body. I chose the human body as a subject because it is the one form that we all share. It's something that everybody has their own authentic experience with." Her early work explored aspects of the human body, such as biology, as well as suffering, topics all too present during the AIDS crisis, which traditionally affected the arts community. In the mid-1980s, as abortion came to the political fore, Smith began a series of works devoted to reproduction and birth. She then shifted focus to the animal kingdom, especially birds, whose ferocity and vulnerability echo the human condition. Our sculpture consists of 13 papier-mâché life-size female body parts covered in gold, copper, and silver leaf. Scattered on the floor, the fragments possess no clear relationship, and the artist does not specify placement. It's not clear how many bodies the pieces represent. The fragments evoke an archaeological site as though discovered in situ. The gold color suggests that it is made of heavy metal, and as such conveys a false sense of weight or permanence. Smith merges traditional concepts of beauty with troubling notions of dismemberment and violence. She's interested in women as abused and marginalized. Smith examined the body as a vessel that could betray its owner. Perhaps, too, she might be saying that a woman is torn between so many obligations in her life. Louise Bourgeois was a painter, sculptor, as well as prolific printmaker. She was a feisty gal. Working into her 90s, she was known for donning a baseball cap and red tennis shoes. She was short, but energetic and charismatic. With a career spanning 8 decades from the 1930s until 2010, Louise Bourgeois is one of the great figures of modern and contemporary art. She's best known for her large-scale sculptures and installations that are inspired by her own memories and experiences. Rather than offering her thoughts on external circumstances such as society, culture, or politics, Bourgeois used her art to kind of work through her internal struggles. Her paintings and sculptures contain bits and pieces of herself. Born in Paris to parents who ran a tapestry restoration business, Louise Bourgeois grew up in helping them in the workshop, filling in missing parts of the designs depicted in the tapestries. The main force behind her work was to work through her troubled childhood memories. These memories were a layering of emotional responses to the complicated relationship she had with her parents and their relationship with each other. Bourgeois' mother died when Louise was 22, and Louise had cared for her for long periods of time. Her father's unfaithfulness, and he had a series of mistresses, and the backdrop of the First World War, which began when she was 3 years old, made her traumatic memories of childhood even more intense. Although this sculpture is not in slam, Grand Maman on the right, for which she is best remembered today, expresses Bourgeois' fondness for spiders. Instead of seeing them as frightening creatures, she stated that this 30-foot-high sculpture was in honor of her mother, who weaved a web of protection over her family, like a spider protected its age. You can't forget seeing your first Louise Bourgeois spider. Has anybody seen them? Yeah, they're pretty amazing. So what do you do? So what do you think that our sculpture represents? How do you interpret the sculpture? The word cell can refer to both an enclosed room, as in a prison, as well as the basic elements of plant or animal life, as the cells of the human body. It was a way for the artist to represent how women might feel if they're safe at home, hidden from the world, or if they're trapped in the house. Cell offers an ambiguous environment of protection and imprisonment, freedom and surveillance. Here, 3 marble spheres are enclosed in a box-like structure of rusted steel, mesh, and panes of glass, some of which are broken. 2 larger spheres both shelter and overshadow the smaller sphere between them, evoking interrelationships of a family that can be viewed as either protective or domineering. It's also unclear if the door to the cell is opening or closing. Does it suggest potential escape from this damaged and claustrophobic cube, or is it protection? Such uncertainty is characteristic of the artist, Louise Bourgeois, allowing the viewers to supply their own narrative interpretation of the objects at hand. Cockfight is the work of a very successful artist whose sculptures have brought her acclaim. Nancy Graves was married to Richard Serra, the one who builds those large steel sculptures that are all over major cities. A prolific cross-disciplinary artist, Graves developed a sustained body of sculptures, paintings, drawings, watercolors, and prints. She also produced 5 avant-garde films and creative, innovative set designs. 5 years after graduating, her career was launched in 1969 when she was the youngest artist and only the 5th woman to be selected for a solo presentation at the Whitney Museum of Art. Cockfight is a vertical battle of fighting roosters. Graves has a strong sense of line, and the work is open and skeletal rather than massive and solid. Graves uses welded parts, casts of found objects like plants and tools. Her subject is kind of witty and shows the influence of whimsy in her choice of okra plants and lotus roots and bananas and squids, all in the same sculpture. Jackie Ferrara is an American sculptor best known for her pyramidal stacked sculptures. Ferrara is one of several artists who emerged during the 70s by using the forms and materials usually associated with architecture in order to challenge the assumptions and conventions of a typical built environment. Characteristics of Ferrara's work include wooden pyramid or ziggurat types of sculptures accompanying horizontally stacked steps, such as in this piece. These pyramids reference generic types of non-Western buildings, such as those of Mesoamerica and Egypt. It's part of a series which Ferrara referred to as places. Many look like small-scale models of temples, yet defy specific historical dating, seemingly simultaneously ancient, modern, and even futuristic at the same time. Jenny Holzer is best known for her text-based public art projects. She said, "I used language because I wanted to offer content that people could understand." Holzer's work deploys text in public spaces across an array of media, including electronic and LED signs, carved stone, billboards, and printed materials. I think there was one even in Times Square. The language in her work contains both original and appropriated texts. Now, our plaques are positioned in stairwells or in places in the museum that you just walk by and you hardly notice. I think you probably think they're instructional, or they'll tell you which way to the restroom. They almost are invisible. And when you read them, there's a sort of confusion, like, what does that mean? And why is that here? For example, let's read this one. When you're on the verge of determining that you don't like someone, it's awful when he smiles and his teeth look absolutely even and false. She has a sense of humor. Holzer's plaque provoke a curious response in the viewer. We're usually a bit puzzled by them. Sometimes we laugh, and sometimes we think, what in the world does that mean? Rachel Whiteread is one of the preeminent sculptors of her generation. Her practice is defined by an ongoing investigation of domestic architecture and the traces of humanity impressed upon such sites. She casts the spaces inside and around objects, be they bathtubs or mattresses, architectural elements such as doors, floors, and windows, or even entire buildings, kind of like you see here. And she uses materials such as resin and rubber and concrete and plaster to preserve each surface detail. The resulting sculptures represent an inverse of the original object. Detached 3 gives concrete form to the empty or negative space within an everyday prefabricated backyard shed. The sculpture sums up her signature working process, which she described as mummifying the air. Whiteread captured the intricate wood grain imprint of the shed's door and sides, as well as the impression of windows. She said, I'm not into what I call plop art, just putting things in places for the sake of it. They really need a reason for being there. I don't think art changes the world in terms of stopping people dying from AIDS or starvation or being homeless. But for an individual, seeing a great piece of art can take you from one place to another. It can enhance daily life, reflect our times, and in that sense, change the way you think and the way you are. These are just a few of the many African American female artists who have come into prominence in the last 20 to 30 years, women who have focused on the African American experience. Now, we're going to look at them and others in depth in our next series of African American art, but let me just quickly go over a few of them. As an artist, activist, and children's author, Faith Ringgold has challenged perceptions of African American identity and gender inequality for over 5 decades. She's widely recognized for her painted story quilts, combining personal narratives, history, and politics to tell my story, or more to the point, my side of the story, she said. Faith Ringgold has worked in a variety of media and modes, from quilts and paintings to performances in children's books to depict African American experience. This painted quilt tells a story of a fictional African American artist living in France in the 1920s. Through Willa, Faith Ringgold reshaped the past to redress the absence of the Black figures in American history. Regarding her choice of the quilt as a medium, Ringgold has said, feminine art is soft. It's lightweight, it's sewing art. Women's art is less rigid, and it's open to all kinds of new innovations. Lorna Simpson examines how perception of identity is tied to appearance. However, her works often do not include the figure in the traditional sense. Wigs, 1994, eliminates not only the face, but the entire body. Instead, she presents us with an array of wigs, which act as stand-ins or surrogates for the figure. She references the body without including it. I think it's really cool. Wigs also features quotes from historical accounts or proverbs that deal with appearances, such as the clothes make the man, or what you see is what you get, or if the shoe fits, wear it. Another of the most celebrated women artists, Betty Sauer, is a true icon within the contemporary art sphere, creating pieces that address race and Black consciousness. After the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, her work became overly political and extreme. During the 1970s, Sauer was a member of the Black arts movement who merged activism and art to give voice to the Black experience. As Sauer has explained, it's my goal as an artist to create works that expose injustice and reveal beauty at the same time. Our print is powerful. The fragility of smiles is a serograph that she printed to represent the schematic placement of slaves as they were shipped as cargo from one country to another. In her pieces, the ship always means slave ships. Kara Walker is among the most complex and prolific American artists of her generation. She has gained national and international recognition for her cut paper black and white silhouette works that invoke themes of African American racial identity. Her subjects, often scenes of slavery, conflict, or violence, are rendered in a style that references the art of the paper silhouettes, a popular hobby in the 19th century. The painting of this kind of genteel art form with disturbing imagery produces a forceful picture that finds tension between the playful feeling of the silhouette and the unsettling details found within. Since 2001, Ellen Gallagher has continued to add to her Watery Ecstatic series, which consists of assorted drawings of marine life, some scientific and others imaginary. In our print, an octopus-like sea creature is painted in watercolor and pencil on a piece of cut paper. The series recalls the myth, a Black Atlantis at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. In the story, an aquatic world is populated by the children of West African women who were pregnant when cast overboard during their transatlantic slave trade. Though Gallagher's persistent markings, botanical and biological marine life, suggest a utopian realm based on a horrific one. We'll look at more of those in a few months. These next artists are connected with St. Louis and have achieved national acclaim. Just really briefly, over the past decade, Mary Giles has helped move the boundaries of basket weaving and earned international recognition for her art, which is characterized by a coiled wax linen base adorned with hammered metal or fine wire that brings to mind tree bark or fish scales or feathers. She took the concept of basketry technique and pioneered using them to make sculptural work. Jane Sauer first encountered the fiber arts movement in 1978 when she was bedridden with a back injury and taught herself how to make baskets out of waxed linen. The artist's pieces reflect her life as a mother to her children and as a productive professional artist. Sauer's closed baskets symbolize these different roles. Sabina Ott's work merges painting, sculpture, digital media, and installation to explore cultural tropes, maps, texts, and abstract geometries. She creates a kind of virtual world like Alice through the looking glass. We kind of tumble through an array of images that assemble into new forms and relationships. I want to end today with some pieces from our decorative arts collection. All three artists are accomplished, talented, and first rate, and their art is absolutely beautiful. So instead of the serious and heavy focus of many of the pieces we've looked at today, I thought I would leave you with simple grace, design, and elegance. Maria Renier is a silversmith born in Hungary who said she had aching hands to make beautiful and useful things. She came to the United States and moved to St. Louis, studying art at WashU, and she spent several hundred hours on one teapot, forming and pounding with a hammer. She felt that silver is so magnificent in itself that it needs no adornment. Annie Albers was one of the most influential textile artists of the 20th century. Throughout her life, she experimented with materials and inspired a cultural reassessment of fabrics as an art form. As a female student at the radical Bauhaus school, Albers made textiles her key form of expression. She inspired and was inspired by her artist contemporaries, among them her husband, Joseph Albers. In these screen prints, Annie Albers revisited designs that she originally produced as linen and cotton textiles. The artist had favored the textile medium earlier in her career. In printmaking as in weaving, she experimented with optical effects, color, and form. In her later years, when the loom had become too cumbersome for her, printmaking allowed her to continue experimenting through new and different media. Tuszynski's distinctive heat-formed glass thread vessels enjoy a widespread popularity and deserved acclaim. She describes her technique as painting with colored glass filaments. She then coaxes, folds, pinches, and forms these semi-molten compositions into sculptural objects. These layers of glass threads are fused and formed inside of a kiln. Tuszynski reaches into the hot kiln wearing special heat-resistant gloves, and she squeezes the glass into a unique undulating form. She wears fire-resistant gloves over her elbows and yet talks of the burns she endured over the years. There is no political or historical angst in her work, no personal emotion. It is simply stunning to be enjoyed. I agree with a critic who said, in an age in which the relevance of beauty to art is widely questioned, Tuszynski's work is uncompromisingly beautiful. It is the one piece of decorative arts that I would love to be allowed to take home. It is really breathtaking. So through the lives and artworks of these formidable women artists, we can clearly see a pattern emerging. From the 16th to the beginning of the 20th century, the struggle was to be accepted into a male-dominated field of painting. Angelica Kauffman, Artemisia Gentileschi, Vigée Lebrun, Rosa Bonheur, and Mary Cassatt fought for their places in the art world, at the same time empowering other women to follow in their footsteps. From the 20th century onward, the narrative shifted to a combination of demanding gender parity and fair representation of women in the arts, as well as exploring what it means to be a woman. Female artists like Georgia O'Keeffe, Louise Nevelson, and Louise Bourgeois had more freedom to dive into their emotions and explore their psyche and transfer their experiences and thoughts on canvas and structure. Finally, modern and contemporary female artists such as Carol Walker, Betty Sauer, Jenny Holzer, and others have liberty and creative freedom to be exactly who they are and express themselves in their political views, comment on the state of the world and society at large. The journey of the female artist was a long and arduous one. It still continues even now, as women are taking up more space and adding their voices to this vibrant, diverse, and ever-expanding world of visual art. Next month, we'll continue to look at women in the fields of photography and printmaking. We'll introduce you to some artists that might be unfamiliar to you. Most of them probably will be, and some that are world-renowned. So I hope you can join us. And I just want to say thank you once again for spending the morning with me, and stay well, and I hope to see you all next time. Does anybody have questions or comments or anything?
We have time for just a couple quick questions if anyone has one.
These are really incredible artists. I hope you will all have the opportunity once the museum opens again to go and see as many as you can. They're really incredible, and they look so different when you see them in person, really.
Thank you so much, Dale. This was another wonderful program, and we look forward to next month's program. And then just so everyone knows, there is a another series that's going to begin in March, Dale? Are we going to start it in March?
In March,
With African American art. So stay tuned for the next series. And thank you everyone for being here today. And Dale, again, thank you so, so much. It's another wonderful program. There's so much information that you share about not only the piece of art, but just about the background of the artist. And it's just wonderful. Thank
Yes,
you.
Dale, that's why we don't have questions, because you're so thorough and you do it so beautifully. Answered them.
well, thanks. There's so much. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Actually, I do have one question. First of all, thank you very much, Dale. Is it possible to get your email? I would like to send you this question. It's kind of private. It's about one Jewish artist. In your previous series about Jewish art, I went through this and I didn't ask it, but I would like to ask later, but it's kind of private. If it's possible to send you an email.
Sure. I'll tell you what, why don't you send it to
Me?
to Judy, and
Okay,
then she'll forward it on to me. Okay. Would that
sounds
work?
good. Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Thank you
Be
very
great.
much.
I'll be happy to do that for you.
Okay.
Thank
And
you.
I hope I can answer it. Okay.
All right. Thank you,
All right.
everyone. We'll see you next month.
All right, everybody take care and stay safe.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.